When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to His blood.
Hello, welcome to our Bible study. My name is Clint McElroy, and today we'll be in 2 Samuel chapter 19. There may be material of an adult nature in today's lesson, so please be advised before showing this to children. We will be meeting at 10 a.m., so please join us for that if you can. If you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. We'll also be meeting at 9 a.m. for Bible classes. You're welcome to join us for those. And you're welcome to join us in the large auditorium at 9 a.m. to watch this class on the large screen if you care to. We want to make sure everyone's aware we have these English Standard Version Bibles from the World Bible School available. They're available to anyone who'd like to have one. If you'd care to have one, please contact our church office and we'll make arrangements to get you one. Our prayer list is quite long, so please refer to our bulletin for more information. We do want to keep in our prayers Linda and Doyle Garrett, Tammy Harwell, Brandy and Jeff Krim, Terry Cox, Sally Jo and Algie Burkeen, Alexander Weir, Aline Kelly, Donnie Glenn Dixon, my friend David Garza, and if you would also include in your prayers a friend of my son, Michael Burke, who I don't know the name of his friend, but he tells me that she is refusing treatment for cancer and will be suffering as a result of that. So please keep this person in your prayers and all those who face the uncertainty of cancer treatment. I know that this must be a terrible burden. As is our custom, we want to remember the story of the two men on the road to Emmaus who were joined in the way by a third man. When they got to their destination, the third man revealed himself to have been the Christ and then immediately left their company. After he left their presence, they remembered that while he had been with them, there had been a burning in their hearts. It's this burning that they had in their hearts that we hope to kindle in our own hearts as we draw closer to the Lord through a study of His Word. We also want to remember the admonitions of Leviticus chapter 19, to be holy for the Lord our God is holy. We go to Scripture to find out what holiness is before the Lord, so we can understand how we should adjust our lives to accommodate that. We also want to remember the story of Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and the prophet that came to Jeroboam. While Rehoboam was king over all Israel for a short period, he listened to the advice of young advisors who misled him in the way to treat the people, and the people rebelled. And the northern tribes that were known as Israel separated themselves from the southern tribe known as Judah. And Rehoboam continued to lead Judah, but a man named Jeroboam came to lead the northern tribes. Jeroboam had been promised by God while Solomon was still alive that he would receive the kingdom, and so he fled and lived in exile until after Solomon's death. And when Solomon passed, he came back immediately and almost immediately received the northern kingdom. God had made a promise to him that if he led the way that David had led, he would receive the same blessings that David had received. But instead of doing that, he raised up high places in the mountains and set up idols that looked like calves before the people and told the people that these were the gods that had led their families out of Egypt. And he set up a false priesthood to service worship of God in the mountains there. And this lived as a reminder of the disobedience of not just Jeroboam, but the people against the Lord from that time until the time of Christ. No king over Israel from that time forward was acceptable in God's sight, because none of them would take down these high places. Now, this prophet that came to tell Jeroboam availed himself of his responsibilities there before Jeroboam and headed on his way home as the Lord had commanded him. He was met in the way by another prophet from Israel who said to this man, "Hey, God has told me that you should come join me for a meal," which was a lie. And the man from Judah, the prophet from Judah, liked what he heard and went to have this meal with this man instead of going on home. As they sat down to meal, the prophet from Israel did prophesy and told the prophet from Judah that he would die as a result of not following the direction of the Lord and going straight home. And indeed, as he got up to go, he was met in the way by a lion and killed. It's a very disturbing story. We have a responsibility to do it as he said to do it, and not any other way. We have a responsibility to believe the Lord and take him at his word. It seems to us to be very unfair, and we need to be mindful that the Lord looks at fairness differently than we do. He has an expectation of obedience, and we should be a people that are going about obeying the Lord. We serve the Lord because he has saved us. He has blessed us in this way, and we should be seeking to serve him in return for the great gift that he's given us. This is why we study. We study so that we'll know the truth, we'll know what to believe and what not to believe. When someone tells us something that contradicts what the Lord has instructed, we should know that that is not from the Lord. So we study so we'll know these things and we'll be prepared. I hope you'll join me now as we enter into this study of 2 Samuel chapter 19, and that you will be blessed as a result of this study. 2 Samuel chapter 19 from the English Standard Version. It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, "The king is grieving for his son." Verse 3. And the people stole into the city that day, as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." Verse 5. Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive, and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased." Verse 7. "Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. Now Israel had fled, every man to his own home, and all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies, and saved us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" Verse 11. And King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, "Say to the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house, when the word of all Israel has come to the king? You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king?" Verse 13. And say to Amasa, "Are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if you are not commander of my army from now on in place of Joab." And he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, "Return both you and all your servants." So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. Verse 16. And Shimei the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, from Bahurim, hurried to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And with him were 1,000 men from Benjamin. And Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and his 20 servants, rushed down to the Jordan before the king. And they crossed the ford to bring over the king's household, and to do his pleasure. And Shimei the son of Gera fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan, and said to the king, Let not my Lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my Lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my lord the king. Abishai the son of Zeruiah answered, Shall not Shemaiah be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? Verse 22. But David said, What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shemaiah, You shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. Verse 24. And Mephibosheth the son of Saul came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. And when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? He answered, My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. And he slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. Verse 28. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I, then, to cry to the king? And the king said to him, Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided. You and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. Verse 31. Now Barzillai the Gileadite had come down from Rogelim, and he went on with the king to the Jordan, to escort him over the Jordan. Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. He had provided the king with food while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. Verse 33. And the king said to Barzillai, Come over with me, and I will provide for you with me in Jerusalem. But Barzillai said to the king, How many years have I still to live, that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I am this day 80 years old. Can I discern what is pleasant and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and what he drinks? Can I still listen to the voice of singing men and singing women? Why then should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little way over the Jordan with the king. Why should the king repay me with such a reward? Verse 37. Please let your servant return, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. But here is your servant Chimham. Let him go over with my lord the king, and do for him whatever seems good to you. And the king answered, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do for him whatever seems good to you, and all that you desire of me I will do for you. Verse 39. Then all the people went over the Jordan, and the king went over, and the king kissed Barzillai, and blessed him, and he returned to his own home. The king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him. All the people of Judah, and also half the people of Israel, brought the king on his way. Verse 41. Then all the men of Israel came to the king, and said to the king, Why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away, and brought the king and his household over the Jordan, and all David's men with him? All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, Because the king is our close relative. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift? Verse 43. And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, We have 10 shares in the king, and in David also we have more than you. Why then did you despise us? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. Okay, so last time we studied out of chapter 18 the story of the death of Absalom. At the beginning of the chapter, David had mustered his men and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds in verse 1. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. The king said to the men, I myself will go out with you. But they argued back, You shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. Because if the king had been with them, and if anything had drawn them away from the king would have been exposed, and he would have been their only target. They would not have been able to draw the enemy in for fighting. This is an interesting tactic here, and an interesting thing that they did. So the king stayed back at this city, and they went out before him with their armies, marched out by the hundreds and the thousands. And then the king ordered the leaders, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, in verse 5, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. And it says in going further here that as the army went out to battle and fought, they fought in the forests of Ephraim. Now, Ephraim is a mountainous region, and there must have been very forested areas as part of the mountainous region. And it says in verse 7, "The men of Israel were defeated by the servants of David that day, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men." It says that the battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. This is very important. When the Lord directs things in battle, he oftentimes does not use the normal resources that you would consider proper for the situation. He doesn't necessarily use the military might of those who are in his service. He very frequently uses strange things about the environment to serve his purposes. And we see this continually throughout Scripture. Time and again, the Lord wants the people that serve him to know that it is he who is delivering them in their hour of need, not themselves. And then a key element of doing that is to make sure that their forces are often too small to achieve the goal as you would expect under normal tactical conditions, or quite obviously that they didn't engage at all and the Lord still vanquishes their enemy, which was apparently most of the case here on the mountains of Ephraim. Verse 9, it says, "Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule. His mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head was caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth while the mule went on. And a certain man saw this and told Joab. Joab asked him, 'Why didn't you strike him down there as you had opportunity? If you'd done that, I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a belt.'" And I don't know about you, but 10 pieces of silver, that's roughly $400. And a belt, how many belts are worth very much? It might have been a greater reward to the people of this time, but it just doesn't seem like a terribly great reward to hang in front of somebody as an incentive. But the man responded to Joab quite properly, in my opinion. Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, then you yourself would have stood aloof." Joab said, "I will not waste my time arguing with you." And he took 3 javelins, and with his own hand thrust them into the heart of Absalom, hanging in this tree, while apparently he was still alive, according to verse 14. The 10 young men, who were Joab's armor bearers, then surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Again, this is a very interesting circumstance here. We find in this passage an explanation of a great many things. The concept that these 3 javelins were insufficient to have killed Absalom as he was hanging helpless in the tree. And these 10 young men who were Joab's armor bearers, and now I perceive as more of a bodyguard perhaps than necessarily what I'd thought of an armor bearer as being prior to this, took it upon themselves to strike down Absalom as he hung in the tree. Then Joab blew a trumpet. The troops came back in from pursuing Israel, and Joab restrained them, it says in verse 16. They took Absalom and threw him in a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a great heap of stones. And then Israel all fled, everyone to his own home. Again, in the mindset that they had done this thing that I'm sure they felt ashamed of doing, and didn't know how to face the king about having done. Then it does a kind of a pause and explains in verse 18, "Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day." In other words, to the day of the writing of this passage. It's an interesting little side note. We do know from other passages that Absalom did have children, among them a daughter that he had named Tamar, the same name as his sister's name. So perhaps he erected this monument in the valley before he had had children of his own. In verse 19 it goes on, "Ahimaaz the son of Zadok said, Let me run and carry the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. But Joab said, You are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead." So Joab knew the seriousness of the situation, in my opinion, knew that it would be unwise for anybody important to take this information to David's ear. David was known to kill people bringing him bad news for various reasons, and I believe Joab was of a mind to prevent that from occurring, especially to Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, one of the priests. So he said to a Cushite who was there, "Go and tell the king this." And so the Cushite left to go tell the king. But Ahimaaz pressed Joab and begged that he would be allowed to run after the Cushite and be there as the Cushite presented the information. Eventually, Joab relented and said, "Go on," and Ahimaaz left immediately and outran the Cushite and got to David first. As they drew near to David, he was recognized by the watchman, and that's an interesting little side story too, that they were able to recognize Ahimaaz from the way that he moved. And as he arrived and presented this information to the king asked, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And Ahimaaz answered with, I believe, a lie. He knew quite well that Absalom was dead, but instead answered that there had been a great commotion as he left the presence and he did not know. The king told him to stand aside, so he turned and stood aside. And as the Cushite came and presented the news, when he was asked, he responded, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man." And the king was then deeply moved because he knew that Absalom was dead. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Which brings us immediately to the events of chapter 19. Joab was told of this. "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." And it says in verse 2, "So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people, for the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son." And they would not come into the city as they normally would have, but instead sought to remove themselves from the sight of the king. They stole in and out of the city as if they were ashamed as people who flee in battle. And it says the king covered his face in verse 4 and cried again, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab came into the house of the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life, and the lives of your sons and your daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you, and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive, and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased." That's pretty bold for Joab to do. Joab is an incredible person in Scripture. He doesn't seem to get a lot of respect, at least verbally, from David, as time and again David chastises both he and Abishai. And this is an interesting thing. It's almost a funny thing that recurs throughout the stories of David in dealing with Joab and Abishai. But he always listened to Joab, and that's an interesting thing too. For all the things else that he seemed to disdain Joab for Joab continually went out before David and did things that were outrageous and yet David left him in charge of his army because he was a skilled warrior. He always respected Joab's statement. And here we have Joab chastising David to his face for shaming people who had preserved David in the face of an enemy who happened to be his own son. And that is a hard thing. I can't imagine the situation that David found himself in there, dealing with his enemy, his own son. Joab goes on saying, "Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night, and this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." So he shames him and tells him, "Look, we're not going to put up with this. If you don't go out, we're going to leave you, and we're going to leave you to your fate." I don't know how serious he was in that threat, because Joab was extremely loyal to David. But Joab also sought to preserve himself and preserve the people. So I don't know, honestly, if Joab was not more a servant of the people than necessarily he was David. But he saw that the proper way to serve the people was through serving David. Then it says in verse 8, the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate." And all the people came before the king. Now remember, David is not back in Jerusalem. He's still sitting in this town outside of Jerusalem, and he's not in his regular seat. He's in the main gate of the city there. There was apparently a meeting place for the elders, and possibly even a shelter there to preserve them from the weather. And apparently David was in this area near the gate of this city. So when the people came, it's talking about the people that had left Jerusalem with him. Now it goes on and says, "Now Israel had fled every man to his own home," the last part of verse 8. "And all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines." So they recognized what David had done for them, and now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. They also realized that the man that they had supported, Absalom, had chased David out of Jerusalem. Then in verse 10, "But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle," and they recognized that failure. "Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" So all the people of Israel, both Judah and Israel, recognized that it was beyond time for them to go and bring back David to his throne. And this is important to the last part of the chapter, because it is all the people of Israel, not just the people of Judah. So in verse 11, King David sent a message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, saying to the elders of Judah, "Why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of all Israel has come to the king?" So he was aware that all Israel had at least started questioning why they had not sought to bring David back to his throne. "You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh." David is sending this message to the people of Judah, his own tribe. "Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa," Amasa was the man that Absalom had set over the army instead of Joab, "Are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me, and more also, if you are not commander of my army from now on in place of Joab." And these words he swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man. So he had moved all of his brothers in Judah to come and set the king back in his place. So that they sent word to the king as one man, "Return both you and all your servants." So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and bring the king over the Jordan. So here they are, meeting at the Jordan River to bring the king back into his proper location, carry him on into the city of Jerusalem, and return him to the throne. Now it's at this place where on his exit he had met the man Shemaiah, the son of Gera, a Benjaminite, who had cursed David and all the people with him. And David had let him curse him, and insisted that they not raise their hands against the man as they were fleeing for their lives before Absalom. So here they meet him again, and in this case he'd hurried to come down to meet David with the men of Judah, and with him were 1,000 men of Benjamin. And Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and 20 servants, also rushed down to the Jordan before the king. They crossed over the ford to bring over the king's household and to do his pleasure, in verse 18. And Shemaiah the son of Gera fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan, and said to the king, Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my lord the king. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered, Shall not Shemaiah be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? But David said in verse 22, What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? And the king said to Shemaiah, You shall not die. And the king gave him his oath. So this is a very interesting story. David was very forgiving. And this is, again, a very interesting character point about David. David would kill someone bringing him bad news, but he would strive in every way to protect his enemies and forgive those that he had vanquished, should they remain alive. This was an incredible characteristic of David, and it was known to most men, but Abishai and even Joab seemed to not understand this about David, and even you could say that Joab was criticizing David just moments earlier because he had this sympathy in his heart for those that set themselves against him. And this was nothing new with David. We saw this time and again throughout David's story, from Saul to the Philistines, and in now these cases with his son's rebellion. It just was not in it for David to hate people simply because they were adversarial with him. And certainly Shemaiah had done inappropriate things, but he was very forgiving of him. And this is a point to take to heart, because we should be forgiving with those who have done harm to us, or to those things that we love, or to those who we love, or the things that we care about. We should be forgiving, and we should be willing to leave these things behind us after we have achieved the win. We need to win over, but once the win has been achieved, we need to be forgiving. It goes on in verse 24, And Mephibosheth the son of Saul came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. David saw this, and I'm sure this was puzzling to him. Certainly Mephibosheth had not been treated in the way that Ziba had indicated that he had thought he would be treated. Now, we don't know how much truth there was in Ziba's statement, but certainly Mephibosheth's disposition and appearance would not support Ziba's statement. And David asks him, Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth? And he answers, I'm going to paraphrase what he answers because it's kind of written in a confusing way to me. He basically said, Oh, my Lord, I told my servant that I was going to saddle a donkey and go, but he deceived me, and he has told you a story that is not true. I did not want to stay behind, but I did want to go, but I was not allowed to because I cannot saddle a horse. And when I asked him to do it, he took my horse, he took those things that he brought to you and told you this story. David didn't know how to reconcile this, and he didn't want to mete out any punishments because Ziba's efforts had been refreshing to David, and he didn't really know what part of this story was true and what was a lie, even though I tend to believe Mephibosheth's story more than Ziba's. And he said, I'm gonna do right by both of you. I'm gonna split Saul's possessions, and you can take a portion. And Mephibosheth said, O king, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home. Which again kind of indicates to me that all that mattered to Mephibosheth was that King David had been preserved. And then we read about Barzillai, the Gileadite, who'd also sought to provide David's needs as he fled. He presents himself, and David invites him to go on with him into Jerusalem. But Barzillai is an old man, and he doesn't see any sense in being a burden to David at such an age, and he wanted to stay near his own home and prepare for his own passing. And David relented and didn't insist that he come with him, but Barzillai did say, "Here is this man, Chimham. You can take him with you and treat him as you would reward me." And David answered, "Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do for him whatever seems good to you. And all that you desire of me, I will do for you." So they went on over the Jordan, and then at some point, Barzillai decided to turn around and go on, and David kissed him and blessed him, and he returned on to his home. The king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him, it says in verse 40. And all the people of Judah were presented there, and they also had half of the people of Israel with them, and they brought the king on his way. Then it says in verse 41 that all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, "Why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan, and all of David's men with him?" So the rest of Israel shows up just in time to complain that these the men of Judah, who were David's own tribe and kinsmen, had stolen David and were going to bring him back without letting the people of Israel do it as well. These were the same men that had all rebelled against David with Absalom, and now they were acting as if they were jealous of this disposition Judah showed toward David. "Because the king is our close relative," answered the men of Judah in verse 42. "Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift?" Meaning no. The answer was no. And then it goes on in verse 43, "The men of Israel answered the men of Judah, 'We have 10 shares in the king, and in David also we have more than you.'" So altogether this was true. There were 10 tribes of Israel, and then the tribe of Judah. And then depending on how you're counting it, whether Benjamin was with Judah or whether they weren't counting the tribe of Levi. It's just a weird thing, or how the half tribes were counted. When Shemaiah refers to himself, he refers to himself as a member of the tribe of Joseph, even though he was clearly a Benjaminite. So, what did that mean? These tribal accountings are an interesting thing if you want to spend time doing it, but it is not straightforward, and it is very confusing to me anyway, trying to figure those things out. So anyway, it ends up at the last part here that they claimed that they had been the first ones to speak of bringing the king back, and in fact this was the case. That's what it was saying earlier. But it ends saying that the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. This is an interesting thing, how those who tend to be truly in the right are often fiercer in their defense of their positions than those that know that they are lying or misrepresenting the truth in some way about their claims. I wish that was 100% of the time, because it's not, and it's very difficult sometimes to discern the truth of a matter by the statements that men present to you. I hope you found a word of encouragement in today's lesson. It is a incredible story it's just an incredible story in so many ways. To be a passage that you don't really think about much, or even certainly not come back and read in reference of anything. It's a very telling story about David's mindset, his love for Absalom, even though Absalom had rebelled and threatened his life, his disposition toward the people, and understanding that while he was mourning his loss, the people were celebrating a victory, and rightfully so. And the necessity of those in leadership to sometimes set aside their personal interests to serve the people's needs. These are all things that are worthy of considerable examination and consideration. It's been an incredible week in our nation's history. Certainly a great many things that are of personal concern to me personally have been addressed this week in ways that I have to say I support. And I am very happy and pleased that the Lord has blessed our nation in this way. I know that this is not the end of the fight, and I know that it's not certainly a true resolution of the issues, but at least as far as civics goes, things make sense again to me. So I do have that appreciation. I also want to apologize. It's been several weeks since I've been able to make a recording. It's not because I didn't want to, it's because so many things have come up from this, that, or the other direction that I did not anticipate. Only once out of those weeks did I really just not do anything because I was personally exhausted and tired and didn't want to do it. And I regret that, but sometimes that's the case. I hope you found a word of encouragement out of 2 Samuel 19, that you will benefit from that. We will be meeting today at 10 a.m., so please join us for that if you can. Hope to see you there. Again, if you're sick in any way, please don't come to the auditorium, but instead stay home and enjoy the streaming service. God bless. Have a great week.